This video is rated B for you'd better back on out of here if you don't want spoilers, buddy. Welcome back, my friends. Last we left off, we had just finished covering the 4th Astral Era, and how it was a time of drastic social regression, giving way to the 5th Umbral Calamity. Despite many societies reverting back to a time similar to that of the 2nd Astral Era, the Ascians still managed to sow enough discord to prompt another rejoining. This event would see the world freeze over, beginning the 5th Umbral Calamity, the Calamity of Ice. Like much of what happened in the 4th Astral Era, no one knows what events triggered the Calamity. It simply happened. As you can guess, hypothermia was a common killer during these times, and countless lives were lost due to the age of eternal frost. Crops failed to grow, and game that was once plentiful could only be reliably found in more temperate climates. Rivers, lakes, and even parts of the ocean froze over. In fact, this was the time when Miqo'te tribes that had been living in southern Ilsabard migrated to Eorzea. These tribes were actually descendants of many Miqo'te that were expelled from the continent of Aldenard by the Allagan Empire in the 3rd Astral Era, most likely due to species-based conflict. The gross majority of the Bloodbrine Sea had frozen over, allowing these Miqo'te to migrate south and bypass the mountains that separated Aldenard from Ilsabard, mountains that had become a death trap due to the Calamity of Ice. During the Calamity, people began to huddle together within Eorzea. Groups and races that previously fought each other tossed their prejudice aside in the name of survival. In the latter half of the Calamity, these groups began to pray to the 12 for salvation, just like in the past. To earn their blessings, they constructed a massive cathedral in the Black Shroud. It was here that many souls would find sanctuary, as those with magical talent were once again seen as touched by the divine and used their magic to keep everyone warm and safe. Since these spells were seen as the light of salvation in the dark hopelessness of the tundra, magical rituals steadily became the foundation on which many groups began to rebuild their cultural philosophies. But, as you know, the calamities don't last forever. Eventually, the snow and ice began to melt, and finally gave way to the 5th Astral Era, also known as the Age of Enlightenment. Many groups that had found sanctuary at the Cathedral of the 12 and other locations began to part ways as the needs for survival became easier to fill. Some priests remained at the temple, but most people left, taking their new philosophies with them. The priests eventually died out as the Black Shroud would grow over the years and completely engulf the temple. It wouldn't be until Bahamut's rampage in the 7th Umbral Calamity that the temple would be rediscovered and revitalized. It now stands as a monument to the survivors of the 5th Umbral Calamity and a place where lovers may declare their unity in the eyes of both gods and men. As the 5th Astral Era began in earnest, these new groups of people began to resettle the lands around Eorzea. Eventually, they started to choose a singular god out of the pantheon to serve as their guardian deity, making shrines and offerings in exchange for their guidance and blessings. As you can guess, this caused a schism to form between the newly developing towns and cities as their cultures and beliefs branched further and further away from each other. What made this era unique was how these cultures began to approach the use of magic. Like stated earlier, these people used different spells and techniques to help survive the Calamity of Ice, spells that were used in the name of the 12. When these cultures began picking a singular deity to worship, they also developed spells and rituals around what they saw as that god's domain, which encouraged magical diversity. Without even realizing it, most cultures had entered into a competition, using the arcane as the way to determine a nation's power and supremacy. Eventually, after about 500 years into the 5th Astral Era, there were 12 distinct city-states within Eorzea, each worshipping a different god in the pantheon of the 12. However, since there was so many of them all vying for power, these city-states weren't entirely stable. Unlike our current age where the borders of countries are well known, the lines between these young civilizations were fluid. They gained and lost land based on their personal growth and development, with some city-states getting absorbed into others. By the 1000th year of the 5th Astral Era, 3 city-states had settled as the largest and strongest of them all. These were the civilizations of Amdapor, located in the central parts of Eorzea, Mach, located in the western basin of Yafame, and Nim, which had claimed the island of Vilbrand and some of the western coast of the continent. Even though the borders of these countries had mostly settled down, things were only getting more violent, and now we'll discuss why that was. To say that magic ruled over the 5th Astral Era is an understatement. Magic drove society, and your proficiency with the arcane sometimes dictated your place in the social hierarchy, leaving people with little to no magical affinity to only ever be seen as commoners in certain civilizations. As such, countries like Mach were always trying to improve their knack for spells and solidify their dominance over other countries. Mach settled into its position as one of the 12 major city-states in the 500s, just like most of the others. But it was in the early 800s that the mage known as Shatoto wove the first black magic spells. After black magic was added to Mach's arsenal, they became a superpower, crushing and absorbing other city-states for the next 200 years until their borders settled in the 1000th year. Since their culture was eventually militarized, the city-state of Mach stopped worshipping the 12 altogether, only believing in their own strength. To my attentive students, the reckless expansion of Mach should sound awfully familiar. Indeed, their behavior closely mirrors that of the Allegan and Garlean empires. This strongly suggests that the Ascians had chosen the city-state of Mach to be one of the major instigators of the next calamity. Comparatively, Amdapor was much more mature about their standing than Mach. Having begun their civilization in the early 300s, they had more years under their belt, and their society had become very respected due to its wisdom and willingness to help the other city-states around it. At the time, the Amdapori border was located right outside the southern sections of the Black Shroud, which wasn't as big as it is today. Since the mages of Amdapor openly worshipped Nafika, the goddess of abundance, they knew about the strong elemental presence inside the Black Shroud and tried to commune with them peacefully. The elements refused, being wary of the mortal races. But those of Amdapor respected the elements' wishes for privacy and did not encroach on the Black Shroud or harvest lumber from it. Amdapor was so revered that it was seen as an older sibling to the 11 other city-states, and despite its relatively young age, the capital was called the Ancient City of Amdapor, to honor its guidance. Amdapor specialized in nature and support magic as well as golemancy. They had a great talent for infusing magic into stone, creating their own guardians and assistants instead of subjecting other living races to servitude. However, in the 900s, they could no longer ignore Mach's rapid and aggressive expansion. To counter the creation of black magic, they developed white magic, which caused Mach's battles with Amdapor to end in stalemates. After its creation, the use of white magic ended up creating even stronger golems than before, allowing their creations to use white magic to various degrees. Mach knew it wouldn't be able to conquer Amdapor without suffering extreme casualties, so they gave up on their expansion for the time being. This put the city-states of Mach and Amdapor into a sort of cold war for the next few hundred years. Meanwhile, the city-state of Nim had been formed in the 500s by a bunch of seafaring Lalafell. Through plentiful trade and commerce, Nim eventually developed into the maritime city-state it's historically known for. Even though Nim was mostly made of Lalafell, they didn't focus on magical talent nearly as much as Mach or Amdapor during their development. They were mostly tradesmen and rowdy sailors, but they did have a strong spiritual and academic side. They revered Oshan the Wanderer and did believe that the foundation of a stable culture was a good education. However, when Mach began its reckless advancement and conquests of other city-states, Nim organized its naval assets into a strong militant force called the Royal Marines. These Marines were clever and were able to repel the initial waves of conquest, but they knew it wouldn't be enough if Mach became serious. Sometime after the creation of white magic, the Royal Marines gave rise to a sorcerer's school known as the Scholars. With their unique magical talents, combined with their already strong naval presence, Nim was able to counter and push back everything Mach had to throw at them. This eventually brings us to the 1300s of the 5th Astral Era. After the stalemate between black and white magic some 400 years ago, an unstable peace arose between the great city-states. On the outside, Mach simply tried to wear a mask of indifference, posturing that it didn't care about the conquest of land anymore. However, in the dark recesses of their capital, they were experimenting with void magic, using it to enthrall countless voidsent and bolster their powers. They even created an artifact called the Nullstone, which they used to control the voidsent and easily banish the ones that didn't follow commands. With an army of voidsent and the refinement of black magic, Mach was prepared to wage war all over again. Likewise, Amdapor boasted their advancements in things like art, philosophy, and peaceful cooperation. These things were mostly true, but as the years passed into centuries, the Amdapori citizens could see more and more combat-based golems and statues filling every corner of their country. Indeed, their leaders were also preparing for war in the only way they knew how, by bringing white magic to its pinnacle and perfecting the spell school of golemancy. No one knows what exactly happened to begin the war, but there was a great deal of posturing and saber-rattling in the early 1300s. Eventually, in the mid-1300s, the fighting began in earnest, and the War of the Magi had officially begun. This war saw devastating spells and massive rituals collide on a regular basis. Like a dark infection, the city-state of Mach sent out legions of voidsent across Eorzea, as the black mages came in afterwards to clean up whomever was still standing with devastating power. The golems and living statues that the Amdapori had been assembling matched and mirrored the voidsent, clashing on the ground and in the air, sending void magic and stone rubble everywhere. All the while, white mages were healing and shielding their units, only to retaliate with radiant glyphs and spells. The city-state of Nim tried its best to remain neutral and away from the war, but waves of voidsent kept coming across the Rothland Sound from the Machi capital, forcing the Nimians to defend themselves over and over again. As the War of the Magi had raged on for more than a century, the city-state of Mach began to fight dirty. They realized that the scholars of Nim were way too clever and powerful to be overcome by brute force. Instead, they set up an elaborate ploy, pretending to be a small settlement helping a group of stranded Nimian sailors. A sect of Machi spies had given the sailors an amphora as a sign of peaceful friendship. The sailors happily accepted and brought it back to the capital of Nim. But this sealed their fate. The amphora was actually a container housing a voidsent named Bitoso. Bitoso wasn't a particularly strong voidsent, but had a special ability that was perfect for this situation. From the amphora he was contained in, he breathed a pestilence onto the city-state of Nim, starting an epidemic called the Green Death. The entire city-state began to panic. Those that the disease didn't outright kill were getting horribly disfigured and transformed into the monsters we call tonberries. All the infected tonberries were forced into the Wanderer's palace as it was turned into a quarantine zone. Many scholars made valiant sacrifices. They willingly exposed themselves to the disease in hopes of finding a way to counter it with their magic and fairies' power. But unfortunately, they were unsuccessful, and many scholars eventually became Tonberries as well. With no sign of a cure, and no idea where the plague was coming from, many leaders of Nim became desperate and started to take extreme measures. The uninfected mages were called upon to swell the waters around the Wanderer's palace, sealing the infected inside with no hope for help or relief. This act caused hysteria, since many infected loved ones and children were now left to a watery fate. Nim had begun to tear itself apart. Meanwhile, in the year 1510 of the 5th Astral Era, the War of the Magi was starting to reach its climax. Amdapor Keep, the first line of defense against Mach, which had stood for hundreds of years, was finally overrun and fell to the might of the Black Mages. After knocking their rival down, Mach tried to seal Amdapor's fate then and there. They summoned a powerful voidsent named Diablos and ordered him to rush the Amdapori capital before they could properly defend themselves. But this was a miscalculation on Mach's behalf. They drastically underestimated the wards and powers of Amdapor's elite Magi. With their strongest golems at their side, they slew all the voidsent that had arrived with Diablos and sealed the Void Prince away, so that Mach could no longer make use of his unique powers. This forced Mach to withdraw and consider their next course of action. However, the reckless use of black and white magic over the centuries had finally taken its toll. The fall of Amdapor Keep, as well as the attack and subsequent sealing of Diablos, marked the world's final straw. Mages from every city-state could feel the drastic ethereal shift in the world. Their strongest divination seers only saw ruin in their future, and all calculations were pointing toward a calamity. Scholars and other respectable mages from all city-states argued with their leadership that the world's ethereal balance had drastically shifted to that of water, and something ruinous was about to occur. The leadership of the city-states couldn't argue with the data in front of them, and went about saving their countries in different ways. The groups that were created to save as many lives as possible from the approaching calamity were called the First Grand Companies. The Nimians that didn't fall to the plague abandoned their city. By coordinating their ships, they used a net of magic on the open seas so that they could safely sail back to the Lalafel's ancestral homeland in the southern islands. This event was called Operation Maelstrom. Meanwhile, the leaders of Amdapor used all their military resources to gather and protect their people as they began a mass exodus to the northern mountains of Abalathia's spine. The city-state they had so recently gave their lives to protect was now abandoned. The Grand Company that formed in Mach had the same idea as Amdapor, leading a massive group of civilians and mages into the northern mountains to escape the rising waters. However, those of the Magi that didn't join the Grand Company declared they'd save themselves through power alone. These people went about creating the monstrosity known as the Ark. Meant to carry people and resources into the sky and out of the water's reach, the Ark was an ambitious project. But even with the countless voidsent under their control, they didn't have the power core needed to carry the Ark into the heavens. They wished to summon Skathosh, Shadow Master and supposed Queen of the Void, and make her the primary source of the Ark's power. However, even with the Nullstone, it would take a mage of extraordinary power to summon and bind Skathosh. But most of all mages that fit that description were either killed during the war or drowned in the rising waters of the calamity. Ultimately, a high void mage named Cessair Blackwind was asked to do the unthinkable. Cessair was always against the War of the Magi and called this plan to capture Skathosh foolish at best and deadly at worst. But the calamity was getting worse, and she didn't have any other alternatives. Cessair boarded the Ark with her school of 53 void mages, and with their combined power, they summoned Skathosh. But even with their combined might, they feared her power, and sacrificed the body of a young and fragile maiden to act as a prison and restraint on the Queen of Shadows. For the most part, this worked, and Scathach was made the core of the arc. With Scathach and hundreds of other powerful Voidsent bound in coffins to power the Void Arc, it began to lift into the air, and everyone rejoiced, thinking they'd survive the calamity. But those on the arc would never survive. Scathach, even in her weakened state, was far too powerful. As her power oozed from her prison, the fetters keeping other Voidsent in check began to bend and break, freeing them from their containment. It was a bloodbath. The Ark screamed in terror as the ravenous Voidsent killed all the men, women, and children on board. Cessair was desperate to stop Scathach from breaking free, so she gathered all her surviving mages together to redouble the seals on the Voidsent. At the cost of Cessair Blackwind's life and the lives of all her students, they successfully stopped Scathach and any other Voidsent from breaking free. But it was already too late, and the only kind thing left alive to wander the now deadly Void Arc was Cessair's loving familiar, Cessair. With the waters of the world swelling beyond limits, the Sixth Umbral Calamity had officially begun. All of the great progress made by the once proud city-states had been washed away, and civilizations across the world were drowned beneath the waves. This brought a horrific end to the Fifth Astral Era, and completes my lessons on Hydaelyn's Forgotten Ages. But next, we'll be moving into what is arguably modern history. Till then, be mindful of your magic, and stay safe, my friends. Hello everyone! Thanks for staying to the end of the lesson. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, subscribe and like this video to let me know I'm doing well. If there is a topic you'd want me to cover in the future, leave a comment about it and I'll see what I can do. Until next we meet, I'll be researching even more of our world's rich lore to share with you. Till then, stay safe, my friends.